Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, September 27th, 2025. Sorry for the third upload of today. I really wanted to talk about Minnesota ever since Governor Tim Walz announced that he was running in the 2026 cycle for a third term across the state. I never got around to talking about the third term as an individual video, and so I decided, okay, maybe it was not present day news and I thought you guys might be bored about it, so I waited to hear if there was anything else out of Minnesota. And believe it or not, I'm sure you can believe it in our current day and age of American politics, but MyPillow's Mike Lindell, the same Mike Lindell who's well known across the Trump world for a variety of different reasons, now says he is taking the steps to run for governor in Minnesota in the 2026 race. Now, Mike Lindell has been well known, like I said, in the Trump style of American politics for quite some time for his very public endorsements of Donald Trump and taking a key role in trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. There's a lot of reasons as to why Mike Lindell is someone who many Democrats would hope would be the Republican nominee for a governor in the state, because Minnesota's actually seen their fair share of really bad candidates when it comes down to a multitude of elections in the state. But Mike Lindell running for governor would arguably be one of the most interesting things to happen in the 2026 cycle. And let me just start out by saying it, he would absolutely lose. Now, the most recent survey from Survey USA in the state of Minnesota, which is actually one of the better pollsters in the state, has found that Tim Walz's approval rating across the state is roughly about equal. Now, as a Democratic governor in the state, he's arguably been quite popular for the past 8 years, but as he goes into the next question of does he run for re-election in 2026, there's a lot of voters out there who say maybe 3 terms is too many. Now, a lot of voters do largely sour on their politicians the longer they are in office. Oftentimes, you are the most popular right in that transition of your first to second term, especially if you go on to win that election. But running for a third term oftentimes is a bit more foreign to a lot of voters that are used to presidents running for 2 terms. They're used to their governors running for 2 terms as well. The majority of states do not allow for, non-term limits when it comes down for governor, and even some of the more convoluted rules. For instance, in my home state of Maryland, you can run for 2 terms, win, but you can't run for a third term. But then after you take 1 cycle off, you can come back and be governor again. There's a lot of different things about Minnesota in particular. Tim Walz can just run, right? And so with Tim Walz as a candidate here, when it comes down to preference of should he run again and approval, it doesn't look amazing. But when it comes down to the actual electoral odds, Tim Walz is set. No matter who he runs against, I will stand by this point, he will win the governorship against Scott Jensen, who ran against him back in 2022. I remember that one. Against any other Republican nominee here, Robbins, Parrish, Qualls. No matter what, Tim Walz takes the advantage against all of these Republicans here. And when you think about why that might be, well, even though he may not be the most, popular, quote-unquote popular governor in the state, you have to recognize that Donald Trump's popularity is far, far lower, and voters in the state have largely really appreciated Tim Walz. Even as of late, we saw that, 3 months ago, his approval rating was through the roof, and we saw that, voters had said they largely approved of the job that he was doing as governor here, 58-39. A lot changes overnight, and a lot of it honestly does change when it comes down to a sample on a statewide poll here. But either way, my takeaway, Tim Walz wins re-election. So we knew that. That was really much what the video was going to be about. We would talk about a bit about who he was going to choose for lieutenant governor, because his incumbent lieutenant governor is not going to be able to run on the 26th ticket as she is running for Senate in the state. And so while we can explore that a little bit later down the line, the focus for today is going to be on Mike Lindell. Mike Lindell, who I believe, if he ends up being the Republican nominee for governor, which I think if he runs, has a very strong chance of that happening, Republicans are screwed in the state in a multitude of ways. And I bring up the 24 election not to say that, Kamala Harris's margin against Donald Trump in Minnesota was one that was exponentially large. In fact, it was closer than it was for Biden, but I do think Tim Walz really did help in the state. I think that it would have been as close as it was for Clinton in 2016 when Clinton only won the state by about 1.5 points. Keep in mind, Kamala Harris did underperform Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Iowa, and yet Minnesota, she outperformed. I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that the running mate was from the state. When it came down to the Senate election, though, it was a wash for the Democrats and Republicans here. Nobody thought this race would be competitive. The question why, Royce White was the Republican nominee for Senate. And when I say he was extreme, I mean it. This is not one of those cases of, Democrats who built out a persona for a Republican nominee where it may not be as indicative of who they are. Royce White, I think 100% stands. You can look at his social media, just scroll through the most recent tweets, honestly, of today or yesterday, and you'll see exactly what I mean. He engages in conspiracy to a degree that Donald Trump never has. He engages in all of this political discourse that only hurts his ability to win over swing voters, and that's why you see Amy Klobuchar, who in her own right is an electable Democrat and does very well in the state, won by 15 points when Kamala Harris was only winning the state by 4. And so when you think about the fact that Harris received 1.65 million votes, but Amy Klobuchar nearly racked up 1.8 million, there were over 100,000 voters that voted for Trump that came out and voted for Amy Klobuchar. The problem with Mike Lindell being at the top of the ticket is that it is no longer a vote about president that drives the down-ballot voting. It is the next highest ranking race, which when it comes down to either Senate or governor, and remember that name Royce White, and I'll show you why you should know it in just a moment. When you take a look at the electoral history for Royce White in 2024, guess who wants to come back in 2026? Believe it or not, in Minnesota, the Republican who wants to run in this state in 2026, who has already declared, is Royce White, who has received the endorsement from Mike Lindell and raised $250,000 planning to run in this race if he is the nominee. This will be the race that's at the top of the ticket for everybody. So then you would rely on the GOP side for a ticket against Tim Walz that could help save off some of the House races and state legislative races. And when it comes down to the elections in Minnesota, I want you to actually take a look at exactly what is at stake here. When it comes down to the Senate elections in Minnesota, Democrats have a 1-seat advantage. When it comes down to the House, Republicans have a 1-seat advantage. It is a tie, actually, in Minnesota that we've seen here. But the point is that once the swearing-in happens, it is a tie in the Minnesota House. And in the Minnesota Senate, Democrats have that advantage of just 1 seat, which means when the 2026 midterms come around, 64 seats we will see, in Minnesota. We'll be looking at in this state to see exactly what happens here. They will be up to run for re-election. In the state house, same exact thing. And so given that we can pretty much forego any competitive nature about the Minnesota Senate election, but when it comes down to the governor's race, they are truly begging and pleading for any type of top Republican to run in this race. Because Scott Jensen, who ran in 22, right now stands to be in the position where maybe he could make this race slightly more competitive. But if Mike Lindell gets to this position and ends up in this race as the candidate for governor, both the Senate race and the governor's race will be won by the Democrats by a tremendous amount. And every down-ballot race will be impacted. The state legislative races, the congressional races, when it comes down to it, right? We saw in 2022, Minnesota's 1st and Minnesota's 8th, that with Trump at the top, really barreled away from the Democratic Party, but there is a possibility that you would find Minnesota's 1st narrow up, Minnesota's 8th narrow up, and a locking in Angie Craig from Minnesota's 2nd District. Wasn't really a toss-up, but more competitive district would no longer be that way. And Democrats could rely on at least 4 seats, maybe 5, pending 6, depending on the collapse that Republicans exhibit in the state. And so Mike Lindell deciding to run for governor, this, to put into perspective too, if you remember some of the other races we've covered recently, this would be like a Doug Mastriano situation in the state. I mean, a complete and total collapse of any type of support from the Republicans on the national stage. Because what they would know with this is that it would just be a waste of money to get anybody in the race, right? To focus on this, because Mike Lindell, 1, can bankroll his own campaign. Number 2, has very high name ID, not just in Minnesota, but across the country. And number 3, Democrats will use him as this pariah of sorts for Republicans down the ballot. Royce White won't be able to counteract that. Right now, he's the front runner on the Republican side. And both of these races will cease to be of any importance to Republicans in the future. And thinking about what we've seen in the past, when Democrats have done quite well in Minnesota, I think about the 2018 midterm elections. When in 2018, we saw that Republicans were 1 point away from losing Minnesota's 1st. They were 6 points away from losing Minnesota's 8th. If that had happened, let me just show you what the numbers would have looked like in that case. If Democrats had shifted the map by just 6, Democrats would have had 7 seats to the Republican Party's 1. And remember, Who was at the top of that ticket in 2018? A very good race for the Democrats in the Senate election. Amy Klobuchar won by 24 points. But also, Tim Walz, U.S. representative who ran for governor and won against Jeff Johnson by 11 points. These races have a far bigger impact than you think. The bad race for Republicans in, the 22 governor race in Pennsylvania was a driving reason. When you look at this race, Mastriano victory of 15, then Fetterman's victory over Oz by 5 was the exact reason that in the down-ballot races, Republicans only held 8 seats. But when Trump was at the top and the presidential became the primary ticket, Republicans had 10. Huge differences practically overnight. So thinking about Mike Lindell, it isn't just that his race in itself, in a vacuum, would be one that Democrats could run up the numbers on. There is a lot more at stake here in Minnesota, which is a state, one of the few, where the partisan balance of power in the House and in the Senate and across the state is so evenly split. The congressional delegation, the Minnesota Senate, the Minnesota House, and when it comes down to it, if Republicans do not have a strong candidate to run for governor, forget everything else. Because the Senate right now is already gone. The governor's race is practically gone, but can be salvaged to a degree that it is more competitive than it is not. But with Mike Lindell at the top, I kid you not, I really do think you are reaching that point of complete and total collapse for the Minnesota GOP ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. And although Republicans have not won Minnesota, it is the state with the longest Democratic voting streak in recent memory. The last time it went red was in 1972. It still is very much a state that is not opposed to having Republicans in a variety of their different swing districts and swing, state Senate, state House, even congressional races. And with Mike Lindell, I promise you, almost all of that goes away. And that's why the GOP at this point could very well be in a very bad position if Mike Lindell ends up on top on the GOP primary side, because with him, reminds me a lot of people like Doug Mastriano, who bring everybody down with them. And now that he's considering this run for governor and seems to be at, quote-unquote, 99% of the steps there, it looks like it's one more step further to disaster for the Republicans across the state of Minnesota. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.